Okay, you're gonna do the introduction, right?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Henry, and I'm the Student Circle Communications Chair. And I'd like to welcome you all to our first installment of our 2018 webinar series, The History of ABPsi and the Next Generation of Black Psychologists. Our main presenter tonight will be Dr. Benson Cooke, the ABPsi historian and full professor at the University of the District of Columbia. So without further ado, Dr. Cooke, you can take it away.
Hotep, how's everyone doing who's on? Those who will be joining, hopefully you'll be able to pick up as we kind of move it along. This is the second opportunity that I've had to speak with the student circle and other early career members about the history of ABPsi, and I decided, because of how the first opportunity went, that I would mix it up a little. In other words, I talked a little bit about the history, and that seemed to generate some questions. And so I asked that those questions be more specific when they were sent to me so that I could begin to contextualize the history of the Association of Black Psychologists around some of the founding ideas and philosophies and some of the kind of esprit de corps that went with formulating this whole notion of an African-centered Black psychology. The questions pertain to how one might consider establishing these ideas in a multicultural class at a predominantly white institution, or how one might effectively compress the information about Black psychology in a pretty short quarter versus a semester period of time, or how could one integrate Black psychology courses into just general psychology? So in that context, I figured that I would start off a little different than before. So I have a brief video clip that everyone can access. In fact, most of what I'm going to share, I'm going to give resources that you can continually go back to increase your knowledge and your awareness and your understanding of what it is that many of the founders were grounded in as they begin to evolve this concept, this theoretical approach to psychology from an African-centered or Black perspective. So I decided I would start off with something that everyone can access as long as you've got internet and you can do YouTube. And it's a clip from one of our past giants, Dr. Asa Hilliard III. And it's from a series that he had the opportunity to do titled Free Your Mind, Return to the Source, African Origins. I want to start off with this because he's asked a question that really speaks to how we should conceptualize Black African psychology. And you'll hear me intermix Black and African in the context that we are African. In this society, we have been labeled many things, but Black is one of the ones that is often identified with African American on the census. So I'm using them interchangeably because of that. This is about a 7 to 10 minute clip that I want to start off with. And then after this, I have several PowerPoint slides that I'll jump in between. And as we kind of move through this, there will be an opportunity for questions to kind of entertain some understanding you want to have, to understand some issue that may have been presented, or just to bring up something that you nor I thought should be brought up at this particular time. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. Hopefully everyone is seeing this. And you'll hear me communicating with Henry Willis as I go through this, because he's been my guide for technology to make sure that I'm doing this in a manner that everyone will be able to see what's going on. So here we go. Let me know if it's not going, Henry.
All it probably do is squeal, but chill. When we start the revolution, all it
I'm Mr. Velt Middleton. We are very glad to have you with us. At the beginning of this century, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois predicted that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and color, the glorification of one and denigration of another or others, continues to play a dominant role in determining how power is distributed. But what are the tools that have been used and are being used to maintain black-white power relationships? And how are words and images being used to control thought and action among people of African descent in the United States and around the globe? When and how does an African become a Negro? How was the myth of white superiority created in the modern world, and how was it projected back in time? So-called Western education for Black children, poison or medicine, the origins of humanity, the beginnings of civilization, royal African images in ancient Egypt, and Africa's gift to Europe. Just some of the topics we'll explore with Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, the Fuller E. Calloway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University. Dr. Hilliard is the former Dean of the School of Education at San Francisco State University. A highly respected educational psychologist, Dr. Hilliard was involved with the court case that outlawed IQ testing for Black children in California. Dr. Hilliard recovered with Julian Richardson, George G.M. James' seminal work, Stolen Legacy, the African Origin of Greek Philosophy. Dr. Hilliard, what does it mean to be Black in America from a psycho-historical perspective?
It's important for Blacks in America to know history. That history includes the history of enslavement in Africa, of colonization, later of segregation in the United States. My own studies as a psychologist of the uses of history have shown that this enslavement had more than one part to it. There was a physical enslavement, but the only way that physical enslavement would work is that the mind also had to be enslaved. And there were a series of processes that I call the dynamics of domination. These processes go something like this, that in order for one group of people, in this case Europeans, to control an African population, it was necessary first to erase African memory. Secondly, to suppress the practice of African culture. Third, to teach white supremacy. Fourth, to control the institution of socialization, to prevent African people from educating their own children, from sending their own messages and so forth through media and what have you. The control of and finally, physical segregation. These are the historical activities that Europeans engaged in order to conquer the continent, to enslave people, to practice segregation. And of course, if you look closely at that list, you'll notice that the first few things on the list are really psychological. For example, to destroy memory or to suppress or erase memory is a psychological operation which disables anyone as an individual who had no memory.
So when you say memory, you're talking about personal memory or what?
I mean the memory of one's group history in particular. Personal memory would be important if we're talking about your own psychological individual adaptation. But you can use the same thinking to apply to a group. When a group loses its historical memory, it is disabled as a result. So these were some of the very calculated and conscious tactics that were applied that resulted in the disabling of the African population. So history, identity, the teaching a belief in white supremacy, each of these is a psychological process that was practiced, and we need to understand that in part by going back and examining the historical record. And having understood it, it's possible to gain control over those things that control us.
What do you mean by de-Africanization, and how did that process work?
Well, of course, that leads right out of what we were just talking about, that the erasing of memory, the teaching of white supremacy and so forth, can place an African population in a position where it begins to reject its own image of itself, its own memory of itself, its own history, becomes less African in conscious behavior, although it's very hard to become, if you're truly of African origin, it's very hard for that behavior to disappear. But it's easier for the consciousness of that behavior to disappear. And so over a period of time, figure the centuries that African populations have been in America, it's possible that the population merely American, each of these is a step or an indication that there is some loss of conscious contact with one's true identity.
You have talked about the neuroses, I guess that's the word maybe, among the European population during this enslaving period. Would you address that, please?
Right, well, if you operate a system of domination, a formal system of domination, by those rules that I talk about, you have to confront the truth. And the only way that you can be consistent in applying those rules is ultimately to bend the truth. And after a while, it results in an adaptive process that we call racism, which is really a mental disorder. It's a disorder in the mental sense because it follows the rules of mental disorder. For example, manifestations of racist behavior as a result of domination are the denial of reality, perceptual distortion, delusions of grandeur, phobias in the face of differences, and projecting blame, blaming the victim.
Explain those, please.
Well, each of these are ways that I guess you call them adjustment or adaptive mechanisms. For example, if you take Africa as it really existed, and you attempt to subjugate Africa as Europeans did, it couldn't work if you're subjugating another human being. So that human being had to be changed mentally into something else, had to be changed into a subhuman or an animal or anything else. But you could not operate and be consistent with yourself. So it required a change in one's mind, which meant that Europeans had to begin to lie to themselves about what Africa was and had been. And in the process of keeping that misinformation going, then one adapts to unreality. So when you see reality, it's necessary to deny reality. So denial of reality would be an example of that, would be to look at the population of Egypt, which was a black population, and to say it was a white population. That's a flat out denial of what the facts say. And that, of course, has been typical throughout history. Perceptual distortion is just simply not getting a clear view of what is really true, even while looking at the truth. Teaching of white supremacy means the belief in the supremacy of white people, or it could be anyone who would follow the rules of oppression. If one decided that their own group was superior to all other groups, that would be an example of what I call a Napoleonic complex, because it is not true that the white group is superior to anyone else, but the belief in that would be a psychological distortion of reality, and in that sense would be following the rules for oppression.
Okay, as we get ready to go to the first slide, you said that racism is a mental disorder.
Yes.
I was interviewing a gentleman the other day, and I brought that up in a conversation, and he said, well, racism is not a mental disorder. He said racism is very ordered. He said that whites, Europeans know exactly what they're doing, that racism is a political and economic convenience. How do you respond to that?
I think it depends on who you're talking about. If you talk about I think of systems as having designers, as having advocates, as having players, and as having pawns. This is from game theory, and I borrowed that from Bob Williams, who analyzes systems in that way. Everybody is not a game maker or a game designer. So the game designer might be conscious of creating a racist system, whereas the advocate probably becomes unconscious. They buy into the system that was created by the designer. And so the advocate is a racist in the sense that I'm talking about it, or the dealer, those people who carry out the rules of the master in the system without really knowing why the master created the system or even that a system was created. They just simply inherit a belief system and an action system. And in that sense, they are players in the game, but they are not the game makers. So I make a distinction.
Now break that down for the person on the street one time.
Right.
Go over that again.
There are some people who are puppets.
All right.
And there are others who are puppeteers.
Thank you. Free your mind.
I'll try to do a better job.
Okay. Free your mind. Return to the source. African origins. Why that title?
Okay. Well, obviously, we've been talking about the fact that the adjustment to domination is kind of a mental adjustment as well as a physical adjustment. So for the person who is enslaved and for the person who enslaves, I've already suggested that there is a distortion between the real world and what they believe. There's a mismatch between those two things. So what we need to do in order to get back at the truth is to have mental freedom. So I like to title this a program about mental freedom. So it's free your mind. Return to the source suggests the way to get to mental freedom. That means going back to primary sources. Instead of talking about what someone heard, let's go to the evidence itself. Also, in the case of African people, it means returning to African sources because that's the only way that renewal can occur. And then, of course, African origins refers to the fact that Africa is the home of many things, and most of us don't know that. And it's been things have been said about Africa to make us believe the opposite of that. We don't believe that Africa was a creative place, that it was a teacher. We believe that Africa was always a recipient, a student of other people. And so African origins, which is the source, one of the sources, by considering those African origins, it's a way to free the mind of oppressor and oppressed. I have a short section that I call the defamation of African people. And the reason that I do this is that it's important to establish the fact that some of the things I said are true. And we won't have time to go into many of these, but I'll just show you an example of the perceptual distortion, the denial of reality, the attempt to erase history, the attempt to oppress culture. All right.
Okay. Going to pause that there. And I'm going to bring us to a slide that I think is really, really powerful. I had the opportunity to recently complete a book that I'll be showing you a little bit later. The title is looking at socioeconomic and educational factors impacting American political systems, emerging research and opportunities. And in it, I had 2 chapters that I pretty much wrote. One of them was titled Creating a Stereotype of a Race as Dangerous, Unintelligent, and Lazy, or Examining Consequences of Cultural and Psychological Conditioning in America. And the other one was an overview of the impact of racial hate and its manifestation of homegrown terrorism in America. And it was from that chapter that I've kind of added this piece to the history timeline of ABPsi, because I think from a psychological perspective, it is very on point, very much on point with the issues. So you can read it, but I'm going to read it aloud. It says, in order to maintain dominance, whites needed more than statutes and signs that specified whites and blacks only. They had to assert and reiterate black inferiority with every word and gesture, in every aspect of both public and private life. Noted theologian Howard Thurman dissected the anatomy of segregation with chilling precision in his classic 1965 book, The Luminous Darkness, where he said a white supremacist society must not only array all of the forces of legislation and law enforcement, it must falsify the facts of history, tamper with the insights of religion and religious doctrine, editorialize and slant news and the printed word. On top of that, it must keep separate schools, separate churches, separate graveyards, separate public accommodations, all of this in order to freeze the place of the Negro in society and guarantee his basic immobility. Yet, this was but a partial indication of the high estimate that the white South placed on African Americans. Once again, to state it categorically, Thurman concludes, the measure of a man's estimate of your strength is the kind of weapons he feels that he must use in order to hold you fast in a prescribed place. This is a quote that comes from the 2001 book, Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Segregated South. It speaks to Howard Thurman. If you're not familiar, he eventually became the head of the theological seminary at Howard University. Prior to that, as a graduate of Morehouse College and a leader there, he played a very important role in working with Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who was president at the time that Martin Luther King Jr. was there, and made the introductions to the nonviolent movement of Mahatma Gandhi from India. So understanding history, you begin to kind of connect the dots in terms of the importance of this. There's another quote that I also incorporate in the chapters I've written. And this one is James Baldwin. He says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense that when hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. So when you're looking at the story of the Negro in America, it's the story of America. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. History is not past, it is present. White is a metaphor of power. What white people have to do is to try to find in their own hearts why it is necessary to have a nigger in the first place. I'm not a nigger. James Baldwin goes on to say, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, then it means you need him. So if I'm not the nigger here and you invented him, you have to find out why. And the future of the country depends on this. Again, all of this from The Fire Next Time, book that James Baldwin wrote that I'm sure most of you have probably read. If you haven't, you probably want to read it. This is the book, of course, I'm referring to that just came out 2018. But this presentation, I wanted to, as I said, address some of the questions and move back and forth through a series of slides and to come on live and kind of show you some resources that I think you should incorporate as much as possible in your future library. General things to consider. These are some of the questions. It's like recognizing that when we look at our young people, we have to see the multitude of issues that not only weigh them down, but impact on them at a psychological level. I think hearing the beginnings of Free Your Mind, Return to the Source with Asa Hilliard kind of laid a strong foundation. And so with this image, since images convey ideas that affect behavior, this begins to kind of provide you with some things to think about. You see her weighted down with issues of, poverty, hunger, neglect. We've been recently hearing about immigration status, and we know it's not just those who are from countries where Spanish is spoken, south of the border, Mexico, Central America, South America, but also people who come from Africa, people who come from other Caribbean areas, people who come from other parts of the world that represent the African diaspora, the spreading of our people. So these are some of the questions. What to consider when establishing a multicultural class at a predominantly white institution, how to effectively compress the information that one might want to teach about Black psychology in a short period of time, and how to integrate Black psychology into our psychology courses being taught. What I'm going to talk about kind of combines all of this. And I'm going to kind of start with the last one. If you're teaching any psychology course, you know there's a tendency to always begin with teaching information that is related to Greek mythology. And Amos Wilson once said, you don't need a history book to teach history. He said, you can use a math book to teach history. You can use an English book to teach history. And part of what he was getting at with that information is not that dissimilar from what you would read if you've ever read any of Aesop's fables. One of the ones that I think stands out most is one called The Scholar and the Lion. So let me start with this and then take you into the story that I have in the next slide. This is a reading I'm going to give you that comes from Jamal Karam, considered the story man. I used to like this and still keep a series of his books when I'm speaking with younger folk, elementary school, middle school, junior high school, to kind of convey different ideas. So it starts off with a statement of thought and ends with a way to contextualize. But it kind of goes like this. The Scholar and the Lion, as told by Jamal Karam, the story man. We must remember, self-preservation is the first law of nature. Now the story. An African scholar and an old lion were walking through the great African rainforest. They were debating about who was the strongest, man or lion. As they entered a clearing in the forest, they saw a huge wooden sculpture. The sculpture was of a Maasai warrior conquering a lion. Look there, said the scholar. See how strong that warrior is. That proves that I am right. Man is the strongest. My brother, said the lion. This does not prove a thing, because if sculptures were made by lions, he explained, the lion would be conquering the man. So what does this mean? It means that, for the most part, knowing where we've been, kind of the idea of Sankofa, tells us where we're going. And that's part of our dilemma, is that the miseducation, as Carter G. Woodson talked about it, of the Negro, of us as a people, has had a profound impact in shaping the misconceptions that we have. So, to answer the question, mythology. So this kind of looks at, what is mythology? What is Greek mythology? Well, I've stated here Greek mythology, and it should be, is the body of teachings that belong to the ancient Greeks concerning their gods and heroes, the nature of the world, which is where you get the concept meta nature or mother nature from, and the origins and significance of their own cult and ritual practices. This gets into understanding something about what culture is. It is a part of not only the religion, but the way of being in ancient Greece. Because what the myth did is it purports to describe the origin of some feature of the natural or social world. And one type of origin myth was the cosmologic myth, which describes the creation of the world. And all societies, all peoples have made great significant contributions to their civilizations, have had these stories that have pretty much guided their path. So this one that I want to talk about is about Antaeus. So what was that? How many of you remember that movie with Denzel Washington called The Great Debaters? And I'm pretty sure if I were looking at you, several would raise your hand and say, I remember the movie, but what point are you speaking to? This is a point where they had been defeated and he was trying to get them to see themselves the way that he saw them, as more than they viewed themselves after a defeat. And so he talked about Antaeus, the gigantic wrestler in Greek mythology, whose mother was Gaia, the goddess of the earth. And he went on to say that he was unbeatable because anytime someone threw him down to the earth, it would make him stronger, because defeat would make him stronger. So to the students, he said, so we should never quit. Now, I add this other piece. Well, who was Antaeus in Greek mythology? Well, he was a giant of Libya. The Greeks at that time viewed African Black folks to be a part of Libya. this misnomer that Libya and Egypt are somehow part of the Middle East is just as false as H2O is not water. It is. So a giant of Libya, the son of the sea of Poseidon, and the earth goddess Gia. He compelled strangers who were passing through the country to wrestle him. Whenever Antaeus touches the earth, his mother, kind of like Native Americans' Mother Earth, his strength was renewed, so that even if thrown to the ground, he was invincible. Now, Hercules, who had a series of tests, if you read the Greek mythology about Hercules, in combat with him, discovered the source of his strength, and lifting him from the earth, crushed him to death. Now, the significance of this related to Sankofa is that if we really understand what they were saying in this story, which came initially from Africa, is that if you don't know who you are, then you are destined to continually be at and under the rule of others. And so it became critically important for many of the early psychologists, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, to begin to talk about the role and the value of mythology. So one of the things that I do in my classes, oftentimes, especially if I'm talking with undergraduate psychology students, is I'll share the stories related to the Roman, the Greek, and then I take them to the Kemetic mythology. And the reason I do that is to help them be mindful of the fact that what they thought originated centuries after really had its home centuries before. For example, if you think of the Roman god Venus, well, the Greek god that preceded was Aphrodite, and the Kemetic, which is part of the Hermetic Neteru, was Heteru. Or if you think about Apollo, Roman god, well, they just copied the same name when they took it from the Greeks, Apollo. But in Kemetic, it was Heru. And the list goes on. Like Mercury with the Roman god, but before that it was Hermes, the Greek god, but before that, Jehudi. And with each of these stories that spoke to how one would develop a sense of values and principles in life, this is the foundation of what we refer to when we talk about psychology, because each of these stories talked about what psychology is a manifestation of. You break the word down in terms of the etymology, psychology, logi, logos, study of, psyche, referring to the soul, the spirit, and the mind. If it had been any different, they would have changed it by now, but it's not. So let's move on. Okay. This brings me to want to kind of share with you, and again, talking about some of what I shared before with the ABPsi timeline. Okay. That we have to always contextualize the reality that we are a people who were part of the first world civilization. To rechange that and refer to us as coming from a third world place is a way of marginalizing, minimizing the essence of who and what we really are. That, as it says on this slide, Africa is the birthplace of the written language, of philosophy, of mathematics, of engineering, of architecture, science, technology, medicine, religious practice, literature, art, music, and other cultural contributions. And this is not something that's just arbitrary. It's based upon historical facts from fossil remains, archaeological remains, metallurgical remains, linguistic remains, oceanographic remains, navigational, epigraphic, pictorial, iconographic, botanical, cartographic, oral, and other documented evidence. Just studying the Dogon, you begin to see this. And so in this context, we're looking at being connected with civilizations that existed over 200,000 years ago. And so in that context, as we move through time, we saw that there was an effort to try to diminish, even more recently, to refer to what has happened, pictured in textbooks as the slave trade, as a triangular trade, where now they're trying to suggest that Africans somehow were migrants who were workers in America. And it becomes important for us to address this because of the psychological impact. So this is where it became critical, moving through the hate and through the human trafficking and bondage, that we would continue to struggle towards our emotional emancipation. And it was 50 years ago that a group of students and early career and mid-career and seasoned professionals came together at APA and said, enough of this. We must define our own reality in ways that will help to release us, not just anymore from the physical change, but as Naeem Akbar talks about, from the psychological chains and images of enslavement. More recently, over the past few years, the Association of Black Psychologists, starting in 2010, began to work along with the Community Healing Network to formalize an emotional emancipation circle process. And this was a way of beginning to look at removing our mind from being suppressed and oppressed by the lies. And so in that context, looking at the evolution of the history of the ABPsi is our legacy based upon some of the early testing that was done, research that made it very clear that so long as we were defined by white standards, that we would be stereotyped and unfortunately stigmatized to be seen in a way that would work against our efforts to gain equity, as we attempted through Brown versus the Board of Education to just get a piece of the pie. Just to get a piece of the pie. It was not about having to sit with white folks. It was about being able to make sure that the tax money we invested into school buildings, into school textbooks, into paying for teachers would allow us to have access to the same things that white schools had. And so when you look at the Larry P. case, this is a book that you definitely should have. This one speaks to many of the proceedings, which I'll kind of touch on a little bit more. Another book which is really great, of course, is the History of the Association of Black Psychologists, Profiles of Outstanding Psychologists by Robert L. Williams, which really begins to not only address those who were the founders of ABPsi, but it also spoke to those who were the leaders of ABPsi, those who were the scholars of ABPsi, those who were the workers of ABPsi, those who were very committed to this idea that we could define our own reality as psychologists and no longer be scraping up crumbs from the American Psychological Association in terms of how we would define ourselves. 10 years ago, the Journal of Black Psychology had a special edition. If you're able to get a copy of this from Sage, I think you'll find it very empowering, as it provides an overview of the history of the association in terms of looking at, again, some of what Robert L. Williams talked about in the book, which he identified in the journal article itself. But the article also talked about developing some conceptual frameworks for understanding our strengths in terms of looking at Black youth. Or it also focused on articles that looked at understanding prayer among African American children, examining culturally structured learning environments, relationships between exposure to rap music videos, attitudes toward relationships among African American youth. In other words, looking at aspects of our culture, what it meant to be tough in a tough world, and the influence of role status on risky sexual behavior among African Americans during the transition into adulthood. Those are just some of the articles, but these articles all touched on what we've learned at that time, 40 years into our role as Black psychologists. The one that you see next to that, volume 39, number 3, which was June 2013, focused on special issues around Pan-African discussions of African psychology. And this was very powerful because we invited the growing international family to be a part of the discussions, which is why when we have our conventions, we refer to them as international conventions for the Association of Black Psychologists. So Africanizing South African Psychology was an article. In Discourse Toward a Pan-African Psychology, Drum Rolls for a Psychology of Emancipation was another one. Shattered Consciousness, Fractured Identity, Black Psychology and the Restoration of the African Psyche was another one. And in Discourse, Mandela is Not Enough, African Yearnings for Psychological and Cultural Wholeness. So these were just some of the articles that were a part of that particular edition, kind of moving us forward. There have been other articles, other points of view. One that came out of Cultural Diversity, which is published by APA, looked at a history and visions of African psychology, multiple pathways to place, space, and authority, that spoke to the impact and influence of the Association of Black Psychologists. Or, of course, one of the editions, the third, of The Psychology of Blacks, written by Thomas Parham, the late Joe White, and Adisa Jamu. So, I mean, if you ever have an opportunity to speak with Tom Parham or Adisa, these are two brilliant scholars among all of our other brilliant scholars, men and women, who've had an opportunity to share their thoughts and their insights and their vision in terms of where we should go. So the History of ABPsi is also the foundation to building that future. One of the things that I always try to convey to those who from time to time run into challenges and feel like, well, I'm not dealing with this anymore, I'm leaving, is that this is your association. It is what you make it. And running away only leaves it in the hands of those who may not have the vision that you can bring to the table. So it's important to engage yourselves with the mission and the history, the vision, the objectives, and the goals that will help us to enliven the minds of our African people, not only here in America now, but across the world, those who are part of the African diaspora. In other words, by preserving our legacy for the future generations, we engage in that concept of Sankofa, remembering that we must continue to move forward as we remember our past, and at the same time plant the seed for future generations that come afterwards. So that is nothing wrong with going back to fetch something that you lost. Knowing where you've been helps you know where you are, which defines in many ways the purpose for where you're going to be going in the future. Sankofa. So move through some of these. Did that one already. I think it's important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this at this point, because what I want to do is I want to move on to answering some of the other questions that you had. But it's important to remember that when ABPsi was initially founded, these were some of the people who, through their willingness to stand up, in some cases to be ridiculed, to be told that their jobs were at risk, or being foolhardy enough to take a stand, that they did so, along with others forming about 200 individuals, women and men, students and professionals, committed to seeing us define our own reality. As such, in the early years, we had a series of leadership that was basically 2 people at a time. So the first groups of leaders for ABPsi, we call them presidents now, were co-chairs, co-presidents of ABPsi as we begin to grow and develop. One of the things that's critically important here is to understand that, again, students played a critical role in helping to come up with the statements that would create a foundation for how ABPsi would be. And that's why I've always communicated to students that it's important. Sometimes you have to remind maybe some seasoned professionals that you're an adult who just happens to be a student, because the critical factor is that we have had contributions from those in their late teens to early 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So age does not determine what you can contribute to the association. Move through some of this. So I want to focus on this because while we were formulated in 1968, it's important to be mindful of the fact, historically speaking, that it was really difficult in the beginning for ABPsi to separate itself from APA. In other words, every time APA would meet, members would go there, and from their interactions there, we would kind of have this quasi symbiotic kind of meeting, separation, I should say, to meet on issues of ABPsi. But it was in around 1970 that Dr. Robert L. Williams, one of our founders and past presidents and current elder, in his speech kind of gave a quote from Marcus Garvey, which said, "Men do not build for others, they build for themselves." And what are you going to expect, that the white men are going to build up America and elsewhere and hand it over to us? No. And that was a construct around which that we could begin eventually to pull ourselves away and formulate our own meetings in a space designed for us, by us, when it was important for us to come together. This is around the same time, talked about the Larry P. case, that you begin to see members of the Association of Black Psychologists engaging themselves in issues of governance, engaging themselves in legal battles, engaging themselves in dealing with addressing many of the psychological issues that continue to negatively impact our community. So it was at this time in '72 that when the convention was held in San Francisco, that the priority areas were testing, research, mental health, prisons, and education. And you probably have a smile on your face in the sense, not that it's a happy smile, but if they were dealing with that in 1972, why are we still dealing with some of these same issues today? The numbers may have moved around. Of course, prisons, education is still always up there. Mental health is always up there. Research and testing still continues to be a factor.
Dr. Cooke?
Yes.
We have about 14 minutes left.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide through just a couple more of these and I'm going to move. The other thing that I found very impactful in my efforts to put together this timeline is that ABPsi has filed a number of amicus briefs that have gone to the Court of Appeals and even up to the Supreme Court, meaning that ABPsi has been intimately and intricately engaged in a number of issues that go beyond what people might think psychologists do. And so that is another piece that becomes important. If I could pull up one more, if you look at March '76, ABPsi filed an amicus brief with the US Supreme Court supporting a petition rehearing Legion versus Weinberger. And this focused on Medicare and Medicaid coverage. So again, ABPsi is what we make it based upon how we address the issues that impact us at the times that they impact us. More. Let's see here. In '92, ABPsi played a very important role with putting a halt to the efforts that were made by geneticists to try to suggest that African Americans were genetically predetermined for criminal behavior. Now, we know that's pseudoscience or eugenics, but the reality is the Association of Black Psychologists members, with the support of ABPsi, stood up and addressed this loudly across the nation. Very much involved in supporting issues around HIV/AIDS, a couple of other things. Collaborating with other organizations. When Hurricane Katrina occurred, ABPsi put in place therapeutic cultural competence in theory and practice so that both APA and the American Red Cross had to follow those guidelines. So the list goes on. So because of time, I'm gonna go from there. Wow, what did I do? All of a sudden now I don't have what I was looking for. Okay, so now I'm going to call on Henry to help me out here. What I had at the top, Henry, is gone.
Yeah, I would go back to your last PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm. That's gone too. The only thing I have up here is when I did, hold on. Nope, they're gone. Okay.
And so press escape to take it out of full screen.
Hold on. I think. Okay, yeah, it's gone. So what do I do?
Go back to the last PowerPoint.
Okay.
And press escape to take it out of full screen.
Oh, got it. Take in show. Okay.
Now try to go to the last one.
Okay, no, I'm in the one I want to be in now.
Okay.
Okay. So this was to begin to address how do you begin to teach? And that was one of the questions. How do you find exactly? Okay. The question was, how do I integrate Black psychology and psychology? How do I compress information? Well, you got to do your homework and you just begin to pull together. I'm about to, what you're looking at, can you see this, Henry? All these slides?
Yes.
Okay. So everyone else sees this. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. I'll bring it back. Hold on. Okay. This is something that I put together. It's close to 400 slides that I use when I'm doing different types of teaching on the subject. And every time I run across something, I'm pulling it together. So let me just kind of walk you through a little bit of it. Again, we're short on time, so it's going to be real short. Okay. Okay. So going back to what we heard Asa Hilliard talking about, I think it's real important to recognize that the ways that we have to deal with the physical enslavement, the psychological enslavement, is to understand the impact of the erasure of our history and of our identity, the suppression of our memory, the teaching of white supremacy, the control of socialization and control of wealth, and also physical segregation. And in that context, I think it's really important that we begin to look at those issues as we talk about the work that we do in psychology. And so in this one, I say in one of my early publications in 2000, that we recognize the psychological impact of centuries of humiliation, disrespect, rejection, marginalization, objectification, nullification, negation, degradation, being stigmatized, stereotyped, dehumanized, and oppressed. Not in that order, but you could do it in any order. But all of these issues, I think, are impactful. And so it becomes important to, I'm going to skip to a few things here. Okay, I like this. Okay, this is Dr. Wade Nobles makes this statement. Power is the ability to define reality and have others accept your definition as if it were their own. One of the things that Asa talked about is the importance of being able to know something about our history, which is why African Black psychology becomes important. Because as our own reality was deconstructed to be reconstructed to benefit someone else, we have to work at deconstructing what we have been taught, which has many, as they now say, alternative facts in it or lies, to reconstruct our own reality in ways that will create a healing for us. And so, okay, let's see here. So I'm gonna go through just a few more slides here. Oh, it's not the one I want. How did I get there? I'm back on this one. Hold on, people. Okay. Okay. So give you a couple of indications of something that I've done. Okay. So one of the things that I talk about is how when one has been given a false history, then it has a profound impact on the kind of education, training, and supervision one receives in a clinical setting. In other words, it creates ideas through images that have a profound impact in affecting our clinical decision making. So there was a study that was done by Schumann et al. In 1999. And it was on a program that used to be on ABC called Nightline. And ironically, it's really interesting, the program itself was pulled from the archive. So you can't even get the videos anymore. But in it, what they did, it was February 25th, 1999. They looked at this study that was done by this physician at Georgetown University, the effect of race and sex on physicians' recommendations for cardiac catheterization. In other words, this was a procedure that can guarantee that anyone who shows symptoms of a major heart attack or stroke could receive a curative treatment to keep them alive. So at a major conference, they did one of the largest tests that was done at that time. In this epidemiological study, they had actors who would talk about the symptoms of that they were experiencing, which any trained physician would say, okay, you're about to have a heart attack, we're going to give you this life-saving treatment. Well, the outcome was that the people who got the treatment kind of went like the white male, the white female, the black male, and then the black female. In essence, what they were basically, and I usually show the clip, I can't do it right here, is that it showed that there is a bias based upon stereotypes. And so a series of other physicians did studies that kind of validated this, that based upon the miseducation that people have about who we are, it impacts their clinical decision making. So I use this as a tool to incorporate the importance of history within psychology to speak to the validation of what multi-psychology grew from, which was Black psychology. So that becomes, important in dealing with health disparities. Okay. That's one example of something that you can do. And I keep going back to that one. And I don't want that one. So go back here again. So that's one clear example of what I do. And I see I'm running out of time. So let me just pull this up real quick. Okay. Historically, it's important to look at the factors impacting our emotional healing as a people. It's important to look at the impact of lynchings, the impact of rape, the impact of, in fact, there's a book that recently came out that kind of spoke to that. And I'm going to show that to you in just a moment. But let me move on so that I can utilize time without missing it. The book is At the Dark End of the Street, which I'll get to in a moment. This is a very profound book, Without Sanctuary and A Time of Terror. And so, where you got the Red Summer, Black Wall Street, New Jim Crow, Slavery by Another Name, Medical Apartheid, Acres of Skin, Bad Blood, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, and then you've got Tuskegee Truths, Even the Rat Was White. This is the second edition of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So these are the kinds of things that I talk about that kind of speak to the consequence of cultural, ethnic, racial, and academic miseducation, which leads to inadequate medical and psychological preparation and training, resulting in poor clinical decision-making, which basically leads to people dying unnecessarily. Okay, as my time is almost out, I want to kind of speak to one other one. I had an opportunity with the Association of Black Psychologists to present at one of the emotional healing circle presentations with the Congressional Black Caucus a couple of years ago. And it was on the whole idea of the impact of stories, folklore, mythology, fables, and cinema. And part of it was speaking to this whole notion of the movie Tarzan. I'm sure some of you probably have seen it, but what was important was that people have an understanding of what was going on with this. So with the release of this movie, they basically took a real life person's history and connected it with a fable to confuse folk. And unfortunately, sometimes our own people participate in it. As you see, Samuel L. Jackson was the key actor who played the real life version of the person who is a real life person who was George Washington Williams. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is the case where an actor read about a real life person based upon what they told him the real life person was, and ended up basically doing a disservice to the significant contributions of the man you see in this slide. That's a real life picture of George Washington Williams, as written about in the biography by John Hope Franklin, one of our greatest historians. And the thing that is important to remember is that for a man who lived only 41 years, he fought in the Civil War, he fought in the Mexican War for them to become a republic, he fought in part of the early Native American westward campaigns, but eventually got out of that. He then went on to basically head one of the largest populated African American churches in Boston. He went on to become an editor. He became a columnist, a legislator for the state of Ohio, one of the first Black senators in the state of Ohio. He was appointed by the Senate to be the first ambassador to Haiti. However, the Secretary of State did not want African folk doing that. I know I'm over my time, but as a consequence of that, he was renowned worldwide. King Leopold of Belgium asked him to come to the Congo in order to help give a kind of public release statement that would soften the atrocities of over 10 million Congolese that were being murdered by the Belgians in order to acquire rubber, gold, diamonds, and the like. And as a consequence of his work and what he wrote about, we began to know more of what was happening. The other thing that's important is this was one of 2 volumes of a history book that he put together. This was the first Black history book. Carter G. Woodson was asked by John Hope Franklin who John Hope Franklin's should look at in terms of whose work. And he mentioned George Washington Williams, who John Hope Franklin had never heard of, because he was considered, George Washington Williams at his time, to be the greatest Black historian. So here you have the history of the Negro race in America, 1619, 1880, volume 1, volume 2, the compendium, a history of Negro troops in the War of Rebellion. And this, he didn't write this, but this speaks to everything that was researched by George Washington Williams. And it has a profound impact on the continual images that we see, portrayed by us. Okay, so I'll kind of bring it kind of to an end, and I want to show some pictures real quick. You'll see my face in a moment. I like this, Dr. John Henry Clark on history. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. The role of history is to tell a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. The most important role that history plays is that it has the function of telling a people where they must still go and what they must still be. And the relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child. And this is by Tony Browder, who wrote Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, along with other books as well. So on that note, now, show you a few things. Okay, let me see if I can do this right. Okay, Henry. Now I'm gonna, try one more time. Okay, This is who's been talking all this time. So I'm just going to run through now and just show you some things you should add to your library. For example, one of the things I use for the person who was interested in how to do multicultural, I like to do what I call a dog and pony show. And so I'll bring in different videos. So I bring in some of my own, which if I were to show you, just see a blank disc. But these are some that come from APA. These are part of the multicultural series. So I have, of course, Dr. Thomas Parham working with African-American clients. I have John Chen working with Asian American. I have Patricia Arredondo working with Latina. And I have Wyona Sims working with Native American, Alaskan, Indian. And then there are others, but those are some of the ones that might be helpful. Other than that, went through a series of books here. This is a good one that looks at African-American psychology. And this is a handbook of African-American psychology editors, Helen Neville, Renisha Tynes, and Sean Yutzi. Very good one to use. There were a series of books that Reginald Jones did. This is just one of the series. Black Psychology. A little bit older, but still very relevant. Counseling People of African Descent, edited by Thomas Parham. You have Cheryl Grills, and you have Adisai Jamu, and you have a few other people who contributed to that. Asa Hilliard, of course, always testing African-American students. The Reawakening of the African Mind, Asa Hilliard again. Of course, can't go anywhere without this brother right here. You know, this is Seeking the Saku, Foundational Writings for an African Psychology by our brother Wade Nobles. This is The Akbar Papers of African Psychology by Naeem Akbar. And again, I can't do justice in the time to show you everybody. So I'm just showing you a few. Kobe Cambone, Cultural Misorientation, and there are many. You've already seen a copy of this one already, The Psychology of Blacks, 3rd edition. This is another one that I think is really helpful in terms of giving you an African perspective. Fukiao, called Self-Healing, Power and Therapy, Old Teachings from Africa. Very easy to read, you know, book that kind of gives you a really good historical context. And I think that those are some of them. And then, of course, Dr. Obinga, African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period. But then there are a number of other books that you can read on the subject that will kind of take you through. I was speaking earlier. This is a great book just to have if you want to know more about the impact of Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony Browder. This was the book I was reading from earlier, Aesop's Fables by Jamal Karam, the story man. Now, this is the workbook that accompanies Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, Tony Browder. For those who, when you ever come to DC, he does tours of DC, Egypt on the Potomac, kind of comparisons as to how the early founders of this country did what they did. I mentioned this earlier, the Larry P. case. I know I'm going fast here. This is, of course, Linda James Myers, right? This is from Ed Nichols, Cultural Competence Schools. And the list would go on and on. I could do this probably for another hour. A couple of things I just want to show you real quick. Some of you have recently heard about the case of the sister who recently passed away. And this is the book that really kind of began to address her story. And it was the story of Reese Taylor. And the title of the book was At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. So this would have been hashtagged decades ago, you know, if that technology had been out at that time. And I like this book right here, The History of White People by Neil Painter. It really helps you to understand immigrant populations who used to be at the bottom of the totem pole until they decided to make us at the bottom of the totem pole. And then, of course, the one that I just had the fortune of putting together with the chapters that I mentioned to you already. So I would say finding ways to integrate all of this, it's going to take collaboration with other people. Every time I would go to a workshop or a symposium or seminar or a presentation, I would establish communication with the presenter, see if we could share some things. Some people don't want to share things because they're publishing, which is understandable. I get that in terms of intellectual property rights. But the goal is that hopefully people are willing to share so that the information can be passed down, so that a person will not die with knowledge and that can be used as information for understanding the issues that we face. So in summary, I've gone way beyond my time. Looking at the history means understanding the importance of looking at the history of ABPsi means understanding the importance of our history as African people. And in understanding our history as people of African people, integrating that in terms of what we have been exposed to in this society since we've been here, and how we must deconstruct the negative, reconstruct the positive in order to begin to find ways of sustaining a healthy sense of being for not just us, but for generations to come. Because it's really ironic that here we are fighting many of the same battles all over again, which means that we have to inoculate ourselves as much as we can. And I think the Association of Black Psychologists is the serum that helps to produce that inoculation, that we can, for generations to come, continue to produce the kind of ideas and the kinds of values and the kinds of principles that can enhance our survival and our enlightenment as a people. And I think that pretty much brings what I have to say to a close. If there, I can hopefully answer questions if I have a little time left.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Cooke. Unfortunately, there aren't actually any questions.
Okay.
So I guess you did a really amazing job at conveying everything.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. Okay. Well, tell me what I need to do. It's time to sign
All right. Time to sign off. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. Remember, you can access this webinar by going to the link tinyurl.com/ABPsi Next. And if you have any questions or feedback about this webinar or any past webinars, please feel free to reach out at sccommunications@abpsi.org. That's sccommunications@abpsi.org. Have a good night.